Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again. Thank you for joining. My name is Amaryllis Estrella, and I am an assistant professor of anthropology and faculty affiliate with the Center for African and African American Studies. I have the honor of introducing our distinguished guest speaker this evening, Dr. Paul Joseph Lopez Oro. Following Dr. Lopez Oro's remarks, Deanna Daniels will be moderating the Q&A, so please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box at any point during Dr. Lopez Oro's presentation. Our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Lopez Odo, is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Smith College. He is also the 2021-2022 Miriam Jimenez Roman Fellow at the Latinx Project at New York University. His teaching and research interests are on Black Latin American and US Afro-Latinx social movements, Black feminist queer activist ethnographies and political mobilizations, and Black diaspora theories in Latin America, the Caribbean, and in the United States. His in-progress book manuscript, Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, The Queer Politics of Self-Making Garifuna, New York, is a transdisciplinary ethnography on how gender and sexuality shape the ways in which transgenerational Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, perform, and self-make their multiple subjectivities as Black, Indigenous, and Central American Caribbeanness. We're having some technical difficulties with Dr. Lopez Oro's video, but we will have him join us with audio today, and the slides will also be present for everyone to see. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Joseph Lopez Oro. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. I deeply apologize for the technical challenges and difficulties. I'm calling in from Hartford, Connecticut, so please bear with me. Just want to first and foremost express my deepest gratitude to Professor Estrella for the kind and generous invitation, as well as colleagues and students in the Center for African and African American Studies at Rice University. I'm very grateful to be in this space with you all. I'm also really grateful to kind of workshop and think out loud with you all about the second chapter of a very much in progress manuscript, but I'm very much looking forward for your probing thoughts and questions. And I'll go ahead and get started for a bit of the context of today's talk. And I do want to most certainly take the time to recognize my presence on territories of indigenous nations, particularly the ones in Texas, and thinking about how sometimes those not recognized by the state, right, are still very much present to bear witness to the centuries-long legacies of survival and resistance of the indigenous people of Turkey. My work could not be possible without a meditation on the impact of settler colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, indigenous resistance, and on the legacies of what M. Jackie Alexander calls crossings, or rather, our continually overlapping histories of dispossession. For today's conversation, I want to offer some preliminary probing thoughts on how Garifuna New Yorkers make, imagine, perform, articulate notions of home, homeland, vis-a-vis public performances of ancestral memory in the hemispheric diasporic spaces of the Bronx, Harlem, and Eastern Brooklyn, specifically Brownsville, Bushwick, and Canarsie. New York City is home to the largest Garifuna community outside of Central America's Caribbean coasts. Since the late 1950s, Garifuna New Yorkers are negotiating transgenerational migrations, building cultural movements, and engage transnational political mobilizations beyond multiple borders of nation states and racial and ethnic subjectivities. Garinagu, plural form Garifuna, are descendants of shipwrecked enslaved West Africans and Carib Arawak indigenous peoples on the lesser Antillean island of St. Vincent. In 1797, British colonial forces exiled Garinagu to the Bay Islands of Honduras, sparking a diasporic ethnogenesis through subsequent migrations to Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and mainland Honduras. At the turn of the 20th century, the United Fruit Company held an economic monopoly on Central America's Caribbean coast with their banana plantations. The eventual collapse of this economy ignited the first major wave of migrations for Black Central Americans to the United States, major port cities such as New Orleans, Miami, Chicago, San Francisco, and New York City. Subsequent Garifuna migrations flow continue to the present day due to electoral corruption, gang violence, land dispossession, and economic repression in Central America. These more recent migrations have drastically shifted the political and racialized demographic landscape of US southern cities such as Houston, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Tampa. I do want to also acknowledge at this particular moment that the entry of Garifuna folks into the US, it is through the US South, right? So thinking about kind of the imperial groundings of the United Fruit Company and its banana plantations on Central America's Caribbean coast, New Orleans, Louisiana becomes an initial hub for Garifuna New Yorkers. New York City becomes kind of the second port city that becomes a major hub for US Garinega folks. But New Orleans, which Jessica Marie Johnson's work and Frank Garitti's work really points to a hemispheric diasporic space of Black geography, which is really important as we think about the UL South and its long history and connection to Latin America and the Caribbean. I want to offer some meditations on the notion of Garifuna Ancestral Memory, Maroon Geographies, and this notion that I'm working through Indigenous Blackness. And I actually turn to the Caribbean, I turn into the literary tradition of Caribbeanness to think about Maroon geographies of Indigenous Blackness. Edward Camus Bratwith, in the closing of his 1975 essay, Caribbean Man in Space and Time, invites us to turn our attention inward to the interiority of Caribbean life and culture. He notes, quote, "My own inclination is to establish a base in the inner plantation and proceed outwards. Connection with the inner metropole, with the ancestors, with the outer plantation and the neglected Maroons. It is here in the interiority of ancestrality and Maroonage that Bradford ignites us to reimagine a terrain of Caribbeanness, right? That transcends colonial knowledge production bounded by outer plantation speculations, but reimagines an inner plantation where ancestrality and neglected Maroons are not simply footnotes, but in the body of the text." Miriam Miranda, one of the most well-known Garifuna Honduran activists and lead organizer of one of the oldest Black Central American political organizations, founded in 1962, which is the kind of official, unofficial date of that organization. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about how Black Central American political organizations have been mobilizing since the 50s and 40s, but don't become officiated until the 60s and 70s, which has everything and all to do with the nation state. Organización Fraternal Negra de Honduras, Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, conjures back with closing remarks. She asserts, and this is Miriam Miranda, "Nosotros somos un pueblo de mar y de tierra. Somos negras indígenas nacidos en una pequeña isla en el Caribe llamado San Vicente. Nuestros ancestros lucharon contra la esclavitud y resistieron el colonialismo en cada respirar. Somos un pueblo que honramos nuestras ancestras, no solo con palabras, pero también en acciones. Nuestras ancestras caminan con nosotros y siguen luchando con nosotras contra el racismo y colonialismo. We are a people of land and sea. We are indigenous Blacks born on a small Caribbean island, St. Vincent. Our ancestors struggled against slavery and colonialism in every breath. We are a people who honor our ancestors, not only in words, but in actions too. Our ancestors walk with us and continue to struggle with us against racism and colonialism." Miranda, both Bradwith and Miranda both center the political and intellectual labor of ancestrality and Maroon geographies as acts of Black indigenous interiority and fugitivity in ways that disrupt colonial forms of knowledge production on the Caribbean and its diasporas. St. Vincent, Central America's Caribbean coast, and US port cities, New Orleans, Houston, New York City, San Francisco, are some of the multiple spaces that come into play with one another, to borrow from Richard Iden, as diasporic geographies of Garifuna Maroonage. Here, I want to spend some time thinking about Garifuna Settlement Day. Garifuna Settlement Day as a space, as a fertile terrain, thinking of the inner plantation and the neglected Maroons, thinking about the inward and outward of the fragmentations of the imaginaries of the multiplicities, not simply as instabilities, but new terrains of knowledge production in and out of the Caribbean. I want to pay close attention to deepening our understandings of Maroon geographies of Indigenous Blackness. And I want to pause here to also acknowledge that while Garifuna folks are not the only Black Indigenous communities throughout the Americas, I want to build on the work of Tiffany King, specifically in her most recent publication, The Black Shoals, where she's really thinking about genocide and slavery not having edge, right? The edgelessness of violence, right? The haunting of that requires a way of sensing that allows to move in out of the blurred and sharpness of visions, right? So I'm not interested in compartmentalizing Blackness and indigeneity. What I'm interested is actually thinking about how Garifuna folks have always already modeled to the rest of the Americas that all peoples of African descent in the Americas, specifically survivors of the Middle Passage, are always already indigenous to the Americas. And how does that certainly complicate our notions of Blackness and our notions of indigeneity, as really sharply putting both of these configurations, these racial configurations, into conversation with one another. So I want to definitely point to the work of Tiffany King that's been incredibly formative in my thinking around Indigenous Blackness. And I definitely want to be able to show you some images around Garifuna Settlement Day. So, Diana. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So this is an image from my ethnographic fieldwork. This is an ancestral gathering, an ancestral ritual being performed by mostly second, third, and fourth generation Garifuna New Yorkers on Orchard Beach in the Bronx of June 2017. It is an image that quite essentially captures a lot of the political imaginaries and the Maroon geographies that I'm talking about in regards to Indigenous Blackness, to Garifuna-ness. It is an image that certainly conjures the embodiment and the performance of ancestral memory. And I want to spend some time talking to you about what exactly is ancestral memory. How does ancestral memory function within a Garifuna worldview? I do want to think about ancestral memory as a concept that is released from colonial domination, and it's one that builds on the work of Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, but it's one that also turns and takes to account the intimacy, the interiority, and the ancestral part of spirituality within Garifuna-ness. So I conceptualize Garifuna ancestral memory as an analytic composed of political imaginaries, mobilizations, and performance of an embodied archive to conjure a past in the present. Garifuna political imaginaries of ancestrality as embodied archives of being and knowing produce political manifestations and mobilizations conjured by Garifuna women for Garifuna folks. So it's incredibly important to note that this conjuring, this embodiment is one that Garifuna women are at the forefront of, and to also kind of just describe a little bit and really quickly the gender politics of Garifuna spirituality, Garifuna ancestrality. It is a matrilineal community. It is a matrilineal community in every sense of the word, not just for the economic structure of the household, but in every aspect, from language to education, to food, to even like literally land right titles, right? But matrilineal in terms of ancestrality, right? So Garifuna women are literally the mediums in which the ancestors use to communicate knowledge, right? So when we're thinking about, even though I don't really particularly care for the term spirit possession, but when we're thinking about a spiritual embodiment in a ritual, in a tradition, in a gathering, Garifuna women are at the center of that enactment, right? So Garifuna women are conjuring the ancestors into the space. And it's important to acknowledge that, because I think one thing that gets left out at times, especially from the larger body of Garifuna scholarship, is the critical foundation of the matrilineal, right? And not just in this kind of anthropological way where it's like, yeah, women are the head of the household, but literally Garifuna women are at the center of every decision making, right? Which doesn't kind of romanticize, right, the absence of machismo, that doesn't take away homophobia, it doesn't take transphobia, right? Patriarchy is still very much in effect in a Garifuna matrilineal space, but Garifuna women are at the center of ancestral memory making and ancestral memory conjuring. So I do want to put a kind of footnote on that really quickly. So I want to closely examine in this particular chapter the sacredness of memory as a manifestation of ancestral presence onto and through the flesh and the political performances of Garifuna Solomonde, the visual medium of film, such as El Espíritu de mi Mamá. And I'll touch very lightly towards the end on the digital spaces, right, as Twitter, as Facebook, and YouTube. But I definitely want to spend some time in Garifuna Solomonde, particularly because Garifuna Solomonde is a public performance of Garifuna ancestrality. It's quite literally the performance that Garifuna folks do annually to commemorate the arrival of ancestors to Central America's Caribbean coast. I'm going to go ahead and play a very quick clip to show you a visual representation of what does Garifuna Solomonde look like in Belize, and specifically Dangriga. Dangriga being kind of one of the many Caribbean coast hubs of Garifuna community and culture. It is not the only one in Belize, but it's one that has received a lot of nation state attention. So we're going to go to the clip now to just kind of get a visual of Garifuna Solomonde.
1823. 91 years later, the reenactment of the arrival of the ancestors of the Yurame still continues. With the Garifuna flag hoisted proudly, swaying in the early morning wind, the participants of the Yurame paddled in, their chants and songs reverberating like the infectious beat of the drums.
We're celebrating our heritage, we're celebrating our music, we're celebrating our language, we're celebrating the way we dress. That's what we're celebrating today. And that is what we should be depicting as Garifuna youth today.
It is a grand celebration indeed, and the Yurame is only the beginning. As the participants dock, a special communal performance welcomes their arrival. Then there is a procession to the Sacred Heart Church for Mass. It has every appearance of a vibrant and flourishing ceremony, but there is a nagging undertone. What is the level of youth involvement, and more importantly, whether they will carry forward this national celebration? Indeed, youths flooded the bridge, streets, and riverside, but are they really out here to embrace their heritage?
That's a scary part, because yes, they're out here in abundance, but nevertheless, it's more for a party setting, because the youth need to really galvanize to carry the legacy, because the Garinaga people have a rich culture that has been suppressed lately for whatever reason. I don't know why the kids not engaging. Sometimes I think it's going to diminish if the younger ones get interested in the culture.
And there are some youths who are interested in connecting with their culture and heritage. That appreciation was sparked from a very early age.
Well, I for sure enjoy it, and every year I go so from primary school, so I enjoy it. Every year we do this for just to show love and answer.
Well, I choose to be a part of the Yurame because my ancestors did it, and so I just want to take up that habit of doing it, because I don't want my culture culture to be lost. I want to uplift my culture and be in it.
That outlook on their identity was inspired by their parents.
It's been easy because we listen to a lot of Garifuna music at home, and what the children do is practice the songs. So it becomes much easy for them when they go older that they can participate in whatever event that leading up to the celebration.
Keep the culture alive, spread the culture, and do more towards the culture and not wait for 19th of November for come for make they spread the culture. So they have to spread it and do it the right way.
So this event is both retrospective and prospective. It is a strong tie to the past, but also a link to the future to instill a lesson of history and perseverance into coming generations. Reporting for 7 News, I'm Courtney Weatherburn.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So the video touches on a whole bunch of stuff, right? And in fact, I find the video to be fascinating when it comes to an intergenerational conversation around Garifuna youth in Belize. But as well, what really captures the attention here is the conjuring and then the invocation of the ancestors, right? And this is where I want to tap into and kind of also contextualize both the history of Garifuna Settlement Day in the region. So if I can get the PowerPoint that goes to, I want to say not slide 2, but I definitely want to come back to slide 2 at some point. Slide 4, if we can go to Geographies of Anti-Blackness in Central America's Caribbean coast. I want to contextualize the slide before that one. Yep. Thank you, thank you. So what I want to contextualize here is the political activism behind Garifuna Settlement Day, right? So Garifuna Settlement Day really begins in Belize. So Belize is the first nation state to have the event, right? So it's not Honduras, it's not Nicaragua, it's not Guatemala, it's not New York City, it's not New Orleans, but it's Belize. And Belize, this happens in Belize actually due to the Garifuna community there that has a very complicated relationship to Creole communities as well as Mestizos communities, but is also the time where Belize is becoming an independent nation state. And Garifuna folks are fighting for land and land tenure and land right. So one of the ways, and you can see this work in Juliet Hooker, Charles Hale, Edmund T. Gordon, you know, one of the ways Black and Indigenous folks on Central America's Caribbean coast fight for political representation, political visibility, but more importantly, political claims to land tenure and land rights is through visibility, through a strategy around visibility. And Garifuna Settlement Day is entirely a project of telling the nation state, and particularly a Mestizo nation state, that they have been here, right? And they have been here before the formation of the Republic, right? Before the wars of independence, which is a very important assertion, but is also a very much important political project around the continued erasure and negation of Black and Indigenous peoples in Central America's Mestizo narrative. So let me also contextualize Central America's Mestizaje narrative, which is not universal. So if we can go to the slide right before this one. Or maybe not, it's probably the slide after, my bad. It is slide number 5. Sorry about that. So when I speak about Central America's Mestizaje project, it's a project of anti-Blackness and an anti-indigeneity. And I actually have some key scholars and thinkers that engage Mestizaje as such. So Central America, like the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, have this very complicated history within this colonial racial project of mixture. And it's actually a project that really emerges at different historical conjunctures, different moments that happen in the building of the nation state. And, you know, even the work of Ben Vinson argues that instead of focusing on mestizaje during the wars of independence, right after the wars of independence, right when nation states are becoming nations and building their national racial imaginary, he looks at mestizaje in the colonial era which has a lot to do with how Spanish colonialism even functioned in the Americas, right? This obsession with pureza de sangre, limpieza de sangre, with the caste systems, right? The different racial groups and categorizations of mixture. But I want to focus on Central America in particular because Central America's mestizaje is a very different narrative from the rest of Latin America. Most general narratives of mestizaje have adopted a African root, right? So when we think about Jose Vasconcelos, or when we think about even in the sense of Puerto Rico, right? There is their notion of racial mixture, their notion of racial miscegenation is one that acknowledges an African root, an African contribution. Central American mestizaje entirely negates it, right? So this is where my thinking around Central American Blackness as a project of foreignness, as a project of the exterior, right? So in other words, Blackness in Central America must come from the Caribbean, right? So it's easy to be like, well, yeah, are not from Central America. Then it's, oh, Creole folks are not really from Central America. They're really just British Black folks in the Caribbean that migrate. So then what happens in the racialization of a geography like Honduras is that Blackness is, first of all, relegated to the Caribbean coast, as if Blackness doesn't exist anywhere else in the nation state. And the way Spanish colonialism happens in the interior, right, where the capitals are situated, right? So Managua, Tegucigalpa, Ciudad de Guatemala, San Salvador, more in the interior and more in the Pacific, mestizos remain in power, right, in political power, and Black folks are seen as just being removed from that space, removed from mestizo governance, removed from those geographies. So it's really important to kind of emphasize the violence of Central American mestizaje as one as always negating the existence of Black folks, and not just negating their existence as not part of the nation state or part of this kind of origin story of the nation, but as one of dispossession, right? So one of folklore. So this is where I turn to the work of like Christopher Loperena. I also turn to the work of Charlene Mullet, where I'm thinking about how does Black indigeneity, right? So specifically Garifuna Black indigeneity, right? So looking at this precise image, right? This is coming out of the Honduran Department of Tourism and Culture, where the nation state negates the existence and denies the existence of Blackness in the nation state. Yet Garifuna culture, right, and Garifuna land in particular, is being used as a site of entertainment, right? It's being extracted as a site for tourism to build an economy that the Caribbean coast for many centuries was left abandoned, right? The folks in the interior of the country were not really interested. And this is where the work of Julia Hooker really comes into play, even in the context of Nicaragua, right? So Managua is building its capital city, and the Caribbean coast is kind of left to the wilderness, right? The way mestizos narrate how they see Black and Indigenous people, they're like, there's no investment until the presence of the United Fruit Company, right? Until the United States imperial power comes to the Caribbean coast and is starting to extract all of the resources and peoples of the Caribbean coast. So it's important to kind of contextualize Garifuna Solomonde happening in response to all of this, right? So all of this kind of interlayer of negating Blackness, indigeneity, as well as land extraction, dispossession of like resources and natural resources, but also this reckoning with the nation state and how Garifuna culture has kind of evolved into this folklore, right? That this culture becomes folkloric for entertainment, for like international entertainment as well, right? So even thinking about very common sayings within mestizos in Central America, this idea, well, all of the best soccer players are Black, right? And that, Garifuna folks will normally say like the only time they feel seen or recognized by the Honduran nation state is when they're playing for the World Cup, right? That's when they feel loved by the country that they've been in since 1797. So I wanted to contextualize that in particular because I think Central America's narrative of mestizaje is uniquely regional. It's uniquely bounded to the Caribbean. It's uniquely distinct, where the national narrative doesn't incorporate Blackness, doesn't think of Africa as an actual root. It actually thinks about Blackness as something that comes externally. It thinks of Blackness as alien, as something from outside, never from inside, which does a lot of discursive violence when it comes to Garifuna folks, but it does discursive violence to Creole folks, right? It does discursive violence to Black Central Americans who may not be Creole or Garifuna, right? But are certainly Afro-descendant. So in Central America has actually been one of the more difficult and challenging places for an Afro-descendant movement, right? Outside of Belize and Panama. But I'm happy to answer any further questions on that context. Let's turn to the next slide on Garifuna Solomonde as an embodied archive of ancestral memory. And I wanna talk a bit about Garifuna Solomonde, the kind of very fabric of it, the setup. And the setup has something very fertile for us to think about, right? So Garifuna Solomonde is very fertile ground for thinking about how Garifuna politically mobilized via performances of revival, exile, and territory. Through an embodied archive of ancestral memory, Garifuna Solomonde is a public act of remembrance, of reenactment, a performative space to embody ancestral memory. In the present day, Garifuna Settlement Day is commemorated throughout the Americas. So there are Garifuna Settlement Days celebrated throughout the month of November, throughout the month of April, April 12th being the Honduran month. Each different Central American nation state has different months. I know that Nicaragua, and Orinoco, and Belize, Dangriga fall on the same date in November. But these celebrations, these performances of arrival, exile, and territory are happening everywhere. They're happening in the Grand Concourse of the Bronx. They happen in New Orleans, in Chicago, Los Angeles, with one of the largest Garifuna Belizean community in the US. So they're happening throughout the diaspora. And they're happening throughout the diaspora as a means of political mobilization, as a means of political imaginaries. So I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the reenactment of Garifuna Solomonde as distinctively Central American and Caribbean. It was started in Dangriga, Belize, as an already present communal practice of remembering the ancestors on the day of arrival to Central America from St. Vincent. An ethnogenesis that is burned into the collective Garifuna political imagination as one of resistance to enslavement and European colonialism. St. Vincent is a place of nostalgia as a site of ancestral memory and the birthplace of Garifuna-ness. In Belize, November 19, 1823 is recognized as the date of arrival of the Garinagu to Dangriga, the largest Garifuna community in Belize, or at least in Dangriga, right, at that time. The very first Garifuna Solomonde Day celebration in the Americas takes place on November 19th, 1941, in Dangriga, formerly British Honduras, as a political mobilizations of remembrance and ethno-racial recognition in the face of land encroachment and anti-Black racism 20 years prior to Belize's independence on September 21st, 1981. This political project of Garifuna cultural preservation emerged as a significant historical conjuncture with the continuous migrations of Black and Indigenous communities along the Belizean, Guatemalan, and Honduran Caribbean coast, and the political struggles for independence of the last British colony in Central America. Garifuna Solomonde was the result of the activism of Honduras-born, Belize-raised Garifuna civil rights activist Thomas Vincent Ramos, who led a national campaign to pressure the Belizean nation state to recognize November 19th as a national holiday. Thomas Vincent Ramos is a particularly compelling political figure in Garifuna's history, whose multiple ties to Honduras and Belize illustrate the fluidity of nation-state borders on the Caribbean coast of Central America. Specifically for Garifuna, Creole, and Indigenous community, whose racializations as Black ascribe them as alien to the mestizo national imaginary. While the historical origins of Garifuna Solomonde merit much more in-depth attention, especially as it also informs a larger contemporary Garifuna political imaginary, my inquiry here lies in the political and discursive labor of performing Garifunaness vis-a-vis embodied ancestral memory in the public space of Garifuna Solomonde throughout the diaspora. So I want to spend some time talking about this notion of arrival. And this notion of arrival is really key to understanding parts of the political project of Garifuna Solomonde, but it really explains Garifuna diaspora discourse, which here I think is really fascinating to think about. What does it mean to perform ancestral arrival, ancestral claims to territory, and ancestral notions of exile in spaces like the Bronx, in spaces like Eastern Brooklyn, in spaces in, Brooklyn City Hall in 2014 during Garifuna Heritage Month. So let's go to that next slide. So here I want to talk about the performance of Indigenous Blackness as a way of troubling a couple of things. So the notion of revival is really quite foundational to Garifunaness. The notion of being shipwrecked is a narrative that is collectively narrated and collectively disrupts a lot of I'm trying to think out loud. I'm like trying to think about a couple of things that's happening, right? Because this image of Garifuna folks, Garifuna New Yorkers in particular in 2014, there's something about shipwreckedness that is performed and is doing a couple of discursive things, right? So my first initial thinking around the discourse around shipwreckedness has a lot to do with distancing throughout the African diaspora, right? So there's this immediate distancing that certain generations of Garifuna New Yorkers use the discourse of shipwreckedness as one that distance itself to Afro-descendant communities who survived the Middle Passage, participated in plantation life in the Americas. So that's one distancing. Another distancing, another moment of this notion of arrival and shipwreckedness has a lot to do with hybridity, right? With this idea of mixture, but not mixture of one that centers whiteness, but rather a mixture that centers indigeneity. And it's a centering of indigeneity that I'm hoping complicates Blackness, right? A centering of indigeneity that allows for Blackness to become decompartmentalized and become borderless and become edgelessness, like in the work of Tiffany King, to think about what does it mean for a community of Indigenous Black folks from Central America's Caribbean coast to be in the United States since the 1950s and still reenact arrival in a space where ancestors did not physically enter. So this notion of arrival in the context of Garifuna folks becomes a way of marking Garifuna ancestrality, marking Garifuna self-making in the sense of in Central America imaginary, if Blackness is ascribed and conceptualized as always already being present on the Caribbean coast, removed from the interior mestizo governance, arrival in the sense of Central America becomes a marking of land, right? A marking of territorio, right? Something that Ofrane and many other organizations and other collectives referred to terrenos ancestrales, right? Ancestral territories. And I think it's important to think about ancestral arrival and the performance of ancestral arrival as one about claiming land, both in Central America, but when it's happening on the Grand Concourse, when it's happening in downtown Brooklyn, when it's happening in Brownsville at a community center at Mother Gaston Boulevard, the ancestral arrival there shifts, right? And it's not necessarily one about placemaking, but it's one about conjuring and bringing ancestors into a space that they may not have physically been present, but using that ancestrality to mark a sense of belonging, right? So this is where this particular chapter is thinking through, but what does it mean to use Garifuna ancestral memory, not only to enact a hemispheric politics of Garifunaness, but also to enact a sacredness of bringing ancestrality into a space through performance, through ritual, through tradition, through song, through dance. And I think here in particular, it's one that really speaks to a larger racial politics of also what's happening in New York City, right? So I think Garifuna folks, interestingly enough, negotiate a couple of things. And I think this image really captures a lot of the nuances of what is happening in that negotiation, right? So that negotiation for me is one that is about marking a certain kind of discursive territory around presence, right? Of belonging, of being here, right? Of being presente. But I also think there's something here in particular that has a lot to do with how do other Black immigrant communities in New York City, specifically thinking about West Indian Caribbean communities, as well as African communities in New York City, how do they use culture, right? Ethnic culture, ethnicity as a marker of alterity, right? And not necessarily a marker of alterity outside the company of African Americans or outside the company of Latinx folks or other communities of color, but certainly thinking about this performance as always already in the company of African Americans, right? So even though this is in downtown Brooklyn, City Hall, during the month of April for Garifuna Heritage Month celebration, right? Garifuna folks, like Dominicans, like Jamaicans, like Nigerians, have negotiated in those spaces and in those geographies a sort of collective solidarity around Black ethnicity, right? Marking a certain kind of Blackness where Blackness certainly becomes embodied through ethnic performances, but there's also there's a persistent narrative, and it's a transgenerational narrative of preserving culture, right? Which is something we all see in Central America's Caribbean coast, right? There's this kind of revival, restoration around Garifuna culture, around indigenous culture, around Creole culture, of wanting to preserve it for future generations, which is certainly what I see in New York City, and certainly what is being captured in this image, particularly because all of the participants in this picture are mostly US born. Some are born in Guatemala, some are born in Honduras, but most of them are second, third generation Garifuna New Yorkers, right? Who in fact don't know much Garifuna in terms of language, but are learning, and are learning through dance, are learning through song, are learning through Saturday language classes, Prospect Avenue, right? So like thinking about the different ways that Garifuna folks tap into this multiplicity of identities, right? Of identities of territory, identities of arrival, but of identities of ancestrality. So before I wrap up, I'd love to turn to a film that I'm analyzing in this chapter. And I do kind of wanna, yep, right there. So I wanted to just kind of show you a little bit of the skeleton of what I'm thinking the larger project to be. And this, what I shared with you was a bit of an excerpt of the second project, where I'm thinking about performing Indigenous Blackness, right? What is the notion of arrival, exile, and ancestral territory? What does it do for Garifuna political imaginaries? But I wanted to show a little bit more about the larger book project that really centers a hemispheric framing on Garifuna New Yorkers, one that really starts in the 1990s with the tragic fire of Happy Land Social Club in the Bronx, where 87 Garifuna folks passed away in a tragic fire, one of the deadliest fires in the history of the city. But it's happening at a particular political moment with the first African American mayor, David Dinkins. And David Dinkins is actually a protagonist in chapter 1, when I'm thinking through Garifuna New Yorkers' activism and mobilization around not only commemorating their dead in the fire, but also establishing a project of restoration, of cultural preservation and visibility in the city. So David Dinkins doesn't get enough credit where credit is due for his amazing just civil rights and political activism among Black immigrant communities in New York. He was very crucial and very foundational to what we even know today as the Labor Day Parade on the Eastern Parkway. He made sure to support Black immigrant businesses, Black immigrant needs in terms of bilingual education programs. So he was actually the mayor that approved Garifuna Settlement Day in New York City back in 1991. So critical moment in kind of the history of Garifuna New Yorkers. And I wanted to just think too, to show also a centering on the political and intellectual labor of Garifuna women, as well as LGBTQ Garifuna folks in the spaces of dance companies. So one of the ways in which Garifuna culture is preserved and restored is through these dance companies. And particularly because language academies or language classes, while they're incredibly important, they're not the spaces that necessarily capture the attention of Garifuna youth. So these dance companies emerge in the mid-90s, and they're all being led by Garifuna women and most Garifuna LGBTQ folks. And one of the things about these dance companies is that they become these, what I call Maroon geographies, these Maroon subaltern geographies, subterranean geographies, where Garifuna folks are practicing Garifuna dance in a church basement, in a household basement, in very kind of not so public spaces. And I conducted an oral history for this particular kind of moment to really capture what were the hemispheric currents of it, right? And at the same time that this is happening in New York City, Garifuna dance companies are essentially being formed in Central America's Caribbean coast simultaneously. And these dance companies not all of them are necessarily in conversation with each other, but they're all shaping each other's political ideologies around preservation and around ancestrality, and using Garifuna dance as more than just an embodied archive, but a space of epistemology making, right? So where Garifuna dances and traditions are being self-made, right? So a lot of these Garifuna dances, and this is where I think political imaginaries are so critical to the discourse, is because Garifuna ancestrality is not really concerned with colonial accuracy, right? It's not really concerned with documentation in a way, in a Western way of knowledge production, right? It's actually more about preserving an interiority of feeling, right? And I think about Garifuna feeling as a queer feeling, right? And queer in the sense of Omishik and Natasha's definition of queer, right? As a praxis of resistance to normative structures of violence, to normative structures of Western knowledge production. And I'm thinking about it in a queerly way to also look at how Garifuna New Yorkers in particular, in nuanced ways, try to disrupt the nation state, even outside of the nation states that house them. And I want to think about what it means to also, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but also think about how does it quite literally mean to be Black Central American in the US, and in specific New York City, is a clear disruption to normative narratives of Afro-Latinidad, right? And how do Garifuna New Yorkers rejecting Afro-Latinidad and claiming Garifunaness as a project of Indigenous Blackness, as their marker of Blackness, and not necessarily the term Afro-Latinx, which a lot of Garifuna New Yorkers argue is a term that really centers mestizos' understandings of Blackness. But how does it disrupt the very idea of Indigenous Blackness in that particular geography? So I'm gonna turn to the very quickly to that film clip, and then I'll wrap up in a little bit.
Hola, mi amor. Igual, mi amor. Yo decía, ¿y por qué?
Pues aquí estoy, mire. Estoy aquí,
Qué
pues.
sorpresa, me alegro de verla.
Pues ya aquí estoy. El motivo de mi visita aquí es para hablar sobre mi mamá y necesito mucha ayuda.
Sí.
Yo últimamente estaba teniendo unos sueños muy raros con mi mamá y sinceramente no sé qué debo hacer. En uno de mis sueños ella me pide que regrese y que la refresque. Y en otro de mis sueños ella me pide de que tiene hambre. Me regala un ramo de flores, ella parece vestida de blanco. Por eso he regresado. Una porque ella me lo pidió en mi sueño y otra porque yo sé que necesito hacer algo para ella. Pues ella falleció hace 3 años y no sé.
Ya hace 3 años ya. Vamos a ver qué podemos hacer por ti.
Bueno.
Porque tú sabes que entre raza nosotros, raza Garifuna, cuando uno sueña con esas cosas, es el espíritu que te anda buscando. Yo conozco una señora que sabe de esas cosas, le dicen Buyey. Te voy a llevar a donde ella a ver qué dice la señora.
¿Cuándo podemos visitarla a ella?
Podemos ir mañana a visitar a esa señora, a ver qué dice.
Por favor.
Usted no escuchó. No verán, no, ni tú, ni Mary Guerrero, ni a Belu Bari, no. Kala tu agbe, kas ne marum tu ade lu malu ba tuen. Ni a Belu Beti tabu bono chu lu Bari, no kala tu agbe. Segundo ya haune suru se mandei tu mundo. Ni a Beti ya he le wani aha ita le butan tabu ka laubet no tu agbe. Ni a Beti tabu bono chu lu Bari, no katma la tu agbe. Bueno. Yang mate wa me bela mai lo yen lele. Yo me ngi lo luz. Eso es lo que pasa tú no lo sé. Juan, tú que yo nada, tú que tú, dile no esto es tú, ahí, tú no tú que, vamos luego botón y tú que tú eres muy bueno y tú que tú, que ne te Maroon gusta para se te tú abate te bella na que tú he, ahí, bueno no que te lo ven de negar algo tú, y ahí voy tú, tú dices tú ya ya te digo na, ajá, ahora el equipo de tú, ajá, de ahí me diga ahí la, ajá, bueno. Bueno, mucho la tati tú esto cuando leía jugo le lecho jugo. Ajá, lecho jugo.
Pues lo que ella tiene es la mamá o el espíritu de la mamá que la anda persiguiendo. Entonces lo que se va a hacer es hacer el trabajo por lo cual usted tiene que dar.
So here we meet Sonia Alvarez, a Garifuna woman from Honduras living as a domestic worker in Los Angeles, California. Sonia's mom passes away when she is in California, isn't able to go immediately after her passing, but Sonia is haunted by these ancestral dreams. She's haunted by her mom in her dreams, specifically telling her that she needs a degu. And a degu within Garifuna spirituality is an ancestral ceremony of spiritual mashing, right? When you literally bring that ancestor food, cleansing, an altar of remembrance, but a remembrance that creates healing, right? And the good is really quite collective. It's widely important as a Garifuna spiritual collective, but it's also one that captures a lot of the thinking around ancestrality, and specifically how Garifuna folks' spiritual worldview is one of embodiment. It's one about a spiritual connection to ancestors, but one that requires political imaginaries around territory, around a sense of land making. So Sonia is returning to this community in Honduras, where she's from, Sambo Creek, Honduras. And it's actually a really important moment of return for her. But I know that we are cutting short on time, so I definitely want to leave as much time available for questions. And I'm happy to answer any further thinkings or probings in the Q&A. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Oro, the conversation was just so rich, and there was just so much heaviness and weightiness to what you've just given us. And so I just want to get into a couple of questions. The first one is, can you say just a little bit more about Garifuna spirituality? I know we saw in the video about the haunting. You talked about conjuring and ancestral memory. So can you just say a bit more about that as it pertains to Garifuna spirituality?
Yes, I appreciate that question. And I'm always a little weary of the question, particularly because I am not a religious studies scholar thinker, but only one that has read the work of like Paul Christopher Johnson, right, an anthropologist at the University of Michigan, who wrote an incredibly important book on Garifuna spirituality and how it travels from Central America's Caribbean coast to New York in particular. But what I would say about Garifuna spirituality is that it really helped me to think through political subjectivity, right? It helps me to really how Garifuna folks are building a political space for visibility, for representation, for land making in ways where Garifuna spirituality is literally one of the most important political tools that Garifuna women in particular engage with, right? So like, even thinking about the work of Miriam Miranda, she calls on the ancestors, right? She brings Garifuna drums to protest. And that's not just performance, just like, hey, this is our culture. No, she knows that genealogically, in terms of heritage and lineage, she stems from centuries and centuries long of Garifuna women in battle, right, in protest. So she taps into that spirituality, she taps into that ancestrality, especially when Garifuna folks are mobilizing against the nation state, against Black death, against La Vidas Negras Importan También, right? Like these global Black Lives Matter. Garifuna spirituality is a key political tool.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go to the next question. So the person asked and said that they loved your discussion of how the performances of arrival in the Bronx bring ancestors to a land they have never been. That's brilliant. They say, I'm also wondering if there's a connection between these performances and the way Garifuna migrants to New York, Houston, New Orleans, and LA, and other cities have maintained connections to village patronatos and community land politics in places like Honduras.
Thank you. And just a big shout out. This is Charlene Mullet, Professor Charlene Mullet, who is a phenomenal Black feminist geographer. Thank you so much for coming through. I'm fangirling real hard, so thank you. But, that's a whole question. So I think a lot of things that make me think, so I do want to like verbally cite the work of like, Sarah England. She writes one of the first kind of books on Garifuna New York. And she really does this brilliant job of like making the patronatos as this kind of, patronatos are essentially these community associations, right? Like these neighborhood associations. So there's Garifuna communities throughout the Caribbean coast, and they're all a collective, right? Most folks are family, friends. Most folks are related through kinship or biological kinship or community kinship, right? But these patronatos become like a way folks stay connected to Honduras, to Nicaragua, to these communities. And I think yes, there is this kind of formal participation in transnational networkings around patronatos. What I'm starting to see, though, which I think is more recent, is this kind of meshing of a couple of things, right? So patronatos, and also patronatos play a big role when it comes to like land rights struggles, right? So these patronatos become this hub, like, hey, we need this street, made into concrete or burned down, or this community center needs this, or this this foreign capital investor created this massive beach resort right on top of our community, right? I'm thinking specifically of like Tornabe and how, the Tornabe Patronato really gathered together. Unfortunately was not successful because the resort essentially still displaced the community, but just ways of like creating these political networks of land protection and land preservation. I do see it, but it doesn't, especially when I look more into like US born Garifuna folks, there's a little bit of a generational disconnect. I do see it more with recent arrivals, if that makes any sense. But there's also this Ofrane, which is the organization I was talking about in Miriam Miranda. They're doing this amazing job of making these patronatos so international that like hemispheric, right? Like there's like patronato offices in the South Bronx for like El Triunfo de la Cruz, right? For, there was a recent attack on 5 Garifuna folks in El Triunfo de la Cruz, and it was literally the mobilization of Garifuna folks in the South Bronx that literally got financial support in this patronato. So I do see it, but I think there's this generational divide, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. So I'm going to ask a quick question as it pertains to the generational disconnect that you just talked about. It also came up in the short clip, the very first clip that we saw. So can you just say a word about how the youth are responding to their embodiment in this kind of way? So I know that one of the elders said that they needed to step up and do more. Are they more active in spaces that look radically different on our social media? I know that that's a part of your 5th chapter.
Yes. Thank you for that question. I also feel like that video, I love the video because there's so much visual representation of like what it looks like the collective gathering of it. But it's a really problematic video clip, right? I think it really makes young people look like, it literally just gives me an image of an elder shaking their finger to young people, be like, you can do better, you should do better. And I'm just like, I don't know if that's really the project here. What I do see is that I do see young people be doing better. I see young people leading the new generation of Garifunanes, right? I see Janelle Martinez, I see Ciria Alvarez, I see Macheto Santos, like I see Arno Martinez, like creating these social media digital spaces, right? These Instagram accounts to honor and preserve Garifuna culture are blowing up for the younger folks. I see TikTok, right? The hashtag Garifuna life or Garifuna culture blowing up because it is young people literally dancing punta on TikTok, right? And this is going to be part of the larger book project, but this is it, right? This is quite literally how do young Garifuna folks born and raised in the US, may or may have never been to Central America's Caribbean coast, how do they preserve Garifuna culture? Right, and they're doing it in these digital spaces, and I think sometimes, I think it's easy to fall into this kind of binary of like, elders are doing it and the young people aren't. They're just drinking and partying, and it's like every generation to its own, right? And I think there's a clear project of young Garifuna folks definitely investing in Garifuna culture. I think what certainly makes elders uncomfortable, right, is when that Garifuna culture starts looking African American, or when that Garifuna culture starts looking very West Indian influence, or when it starts looking very like, I don't know if this is reggaeton or punta, right? Like it becomes this moment where it's like, oh, are we losing culture? And I think that is an anthropological issue on some real life.
And I totally understand that.
Yeah.
So two interrelated questions, just because
Yeah.
we're running short on time. So you just talked about how that the culture might shift, it might look something different, look differently. So what's one action step you would like people to take to help preserve these kinds of cultures? And then in connection to that, how best can we, those who are not out or who are outside of the Garifuna community, how can we stand in solidarity with the Garifuna people, especially in terms of like,
Mhm.
et cetera?
Yeah, so I was really excited when Professor Estrella was like, "Hey, come talk about your work," and I'm like, in Houston, Texas, the second largest Garifuna community in the United States, absolutely, right? I think, in a real sense, right? Like Houston, quite literally. I mean, at this point, I'm convinced that the Garifuna community in Houston is 10 times larger than the one in New York City because, and this is where it's really fascinating, a lot of Garifuna New Yorkers are migrating to Houston. So it's not just recent arrival folks who are crossing the US-Mexico border, which is also another important part, right? It's like, we also don't imagine Black people crossing the US-Mexico border. So Garifuna entirely invisibilized in that migration. But Houston has a huge Garifuna population. And I think first of all, there's some really great Garifuna restaurants in downtown Houston. But I think the solidarity, the support comes with just cultural knowledge sharing, right? I think there's a lot of, and I think Garifuna folks, and I think other communities, other Black diasporic communities, but Black folks throughout the diaspora have done a really good job of like supporting one another, right? In terms of getting to know each other's culture. One of I know that at the University of Texas at Austin, the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies has a study abroad program for undergraduate students, specifically centering African American students to come to Central America's Caribbean coast to learn about Garifuna and Creole culture, right? Intentionally made and created for African American students to learn about the Black diaspora south of the US South, right? So I think it's cultural knowledge exchange. I think it's going to community events. I think it's also learning about the culture, but it's also a point of solidarity, right? Like I think a lot of elders are constantly worried about losing Garifuna culture to African American culture, to West Indian culture. And I think it'd be a good moment of also giving equal knowledge back and forth with elders to be like, no, African American culture actually builds and expands Garifuna culture. It's not a disruption to it, it's an add-on to it.
Thank you, Deanna, for moderating the Q&A. And thank you again to Dr. Lopez Oro, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Smith College, and 2021-2022 Miriam Jimenez Roman Fellow at the Latinx Project at New York University. Thank you as well to John Waterhouse and Eric Granquist for all of their technical support this evening. And thank you all in the audience for joining us and for your questions. Please feel free to join us for upcoming events, as well as a recording of tonight's events by checking out the links in the chat. I hope everyone has a good night and take care.